So firstly, I should, I did do a little introduction piece and I've sent it out to all the listeners that we have, introducing who you are. But I might just very quickly recap that just a little bit so that we're all on the same page. So Rosemary Wanganeen, I've pronounced that correctly?
So
Wanganeen.
Wanganeen.
Wanganeen, sorry, is a proud South Australian Aboriginal woman. You've been in this space for a number of years, researching, being an intuitive researcher initially, and then you've established this beautiful healing center for Griefology, which is really the cornerstone of what it is that you work in. And your mantra, which I think is absolutely beautiful, is that our business model is to not stop until it's synonymous with Aboriginal prosperity, which I think is it speaks volumes, really, because as for myself, having lived in Australia for over 30 years and watched the media and listened to what's happening in the world out there, you begin to understand, and having worked in health for such a long time, you begin to sort of say, well, what else can we do? And I think it's wonderful that you're exploring this and you're raising the awareness of people around this topic. So once again, a huge thank you to a leading figure in this space and coming in and giving us the opportunity to sort of learn a little bit more about what you do, how you do it, and what we can learn through this process as well. So thank you. So I might just dive into it if I could, Rosemary. And this is really, as you know, is a casual conversation. So it's really sort of trying to learn a little bit more about what Griefology means in the context of what we do. But before I go down that path, if I could, I wondered if we could explore how people deal with loss. I know that loss and grief are the big picture things that we're talking about, but not so much loss in the sense of a death of someone that you love, but really looking at loss of an existing relationship. So, for instance, if we listen to the media or what's happening in the world, largely you hear about people going through domestic violence, suicide. Obviously, that's a death, though. But people who lose loved ones through arguments, relationship breakups. And depression is quite closely linked to that level of loss. So in your experience in this space, would you say that's fairly similar to losing someone who's died? And how do people deal with those sorts of that level of loss, I guess, if someone's still here, but you just don't have anything to do with them anymore?
That's right. Yes, there's so many layers to loss, and what I'd like to share with you before I sort of go into that question is, in my research, I found that there are two categories of loss. There's tangible losses, and that is losses that can be experienced through our 5 human senses: sight, touch, feel, taste, hear. And then there's intangible losses. So they're losses that can't be experienced by our 5 human senses. For example, loss of confidence, self-esteem, self-worth, pride, self-respect. But they are really, really significant in the healing process. So that's what I found comes under the banner of loss. And so what you just touched on then, they would be under the banner of tangible losses. So divorces, separation, even children going from home, their family to kindergarten to primary school to high school out into the real world. The loss of a pet, loss of a job, loss of status, loss of something that one might have applied for a higher paying position and didn't get the job, getting the sack. They are and they are so wide and varied. They take in every human experience. But what I found in my model, through my training through bereavement educational services, that there are 8 common grief emotions that we work with. And those 8 common grief emotions are things like grief. And I want you to recognize how I've put the word grief in front of all of these 8 common grief emotions, because when I did my training, they train us to just think about them in terms of, you know, guilt, anger, apathy, panic, etc. But what I've started to do years ago was I really wanted to solidify these 8 common grief emotions by putting grief in front of them. For example, so these 8 common grief emotions are grief guilt, grief anger, grief apathy, grief panic, grief depression, so grief depression, grief tears, and grief shock. Then when, if and when all of those 7 are suppressed and unresolved, then they can impact on the physical body. So that 8th one is looking at grief illness. That is a part of the grieving process when it's suppressed and unresolved. So just those 8 common grief emotions are, they flow throughout the human body, mind, and spirit. And my role is to help my clients identify which one of those that they're trapped in, and there is more than likely there'll be more than one of those grief emotions that they're trapped in based on the loss.
Yeah, that is, I haven't thought of it that way, actually. It's so true, because you know, you don't recognize that emotion most of the time. You kind of go through life, and you're right, you know, a loss of a rejection of an application of a job, perhaps, you know, that's a bit of a loss. You kind of, you know, get yourself strong again, and you keep going out into the world. A loss of a pet, which people sort of, you know, it's just a dog or a cat, you get over it. But really, for people, that's a closeness, a relationship you've had with that being. Loss of relationships is significant. People sort of assume that, oh, well, you know, your relationship didn't work out, you strengthen up and go face the world again. And there are so many people going through this. And if you actually read the research and you look at what's happening in the world, it's so compounded, isn't it? Because we just suppress a lot of that because we're so keen to still continue and not deal with that.
And Mel, the critical thing that I found in my research, I had to, unbeknownst to me, I had to find my way all the way back to a guy called Plato.
Yeah.
And Plato coined the idea that grief is not only illogical, but it's a weakness. He coined that phrase back in 388 BC. Now, it's almost like I want to say, what the heck has an Aboriginal woman got to do with Plato?
Yeah.
But my research forced me all the way back to finding him for me to be able to say, okay. If he coined that idea, why? And he coined it because he was in deep grief himself for the loss of his beloved teacher, Socrates.
Right.
So here he is, deeply grieving for Socrates, had nowhere to go to actually grieve in a safe and culturally appropriate way. He was forced to suppress it and shut it down, which then, yes, it made his physical body weak. But by coining that, young boys in this era who became young men, who became old men, out of fear of being labelled weak, shut down their healthy human bodily need to actually grieve through those 8 common grief emotions that I just named. But namely, they shut down their grief, their healthy grief anger. And I'm figuring, so what happens to their physical body? Because they're just human, just like me. What happened to their physical body? Suppressing their grief, healthy grief anger. Well, my theory is that the body is like a container. Suppressing grief, healthy grief, anger, the body, it starts to store this unhealthy grief, anger. So it starts to convert into unhealthy grief energy, and the body has got to do something with that. So it comes out, it externalizes itself to become unhealthy grief, anger. It becomes rage. That goes into grief, inhumane atrocities, and then psychopathic behaviours. And so if you look around that era, post-Plato, then you look at the Roman Empire comes into being, and then my theory is that somewhere, somehow, the Roman Empire, in those very early days, started to see we can harness all these young boys who become young men, who become old men. We can harness their unhealthy grief, anger, rage, violence, psychopathic behaviours, and use that to commit atrocities around that part of the world. And so when I found Plato, that's when I knew that when 1788 arrived here and all this violence, that explained to me why 1780 arrived here so violently and without any shaming, blaming, vilifying, demonizing. It was just to explain why. And that's why I think grief is so misunderstood today.
Yeah.
People actually don't know, people don't know how to grieve anymore. I mean, we've had Kubler-Ross, American psychologist, but her model was great at the time. She's trying to help society understand loss and grief, but it's outdated now, and I think that's why I've sort of found my model of loss and grief. So yeah, my purpose of finding Plato was to say, thank you, Plato, but it's time for us as humans, contemporary modern humans, to find our way back to a healthy grieving process.
And I think you make a really good point in that association of how the inability to actually deal with that emotion, grief, or even label it as grief, and then try to build coping mechanisms of how do I then navigate myself out of this grief into a better place. But instead, I guess it's years and years of one thing, suppression, the next thing being seen as a weak individual that then compounds the way the person releases that energy, and that's through an act of violence or an act of rage. And now we see that, so it's like a common behavior pattern of a lot of situations. I mean, both in the males and females, I guess, as genders. It kind of brings me to the next question, if I may, because I think you sort of really the right segue here is to sort of to understand how Aboriginal people do grieve and deal with death. One of the things that I, through the years of learning and interacting with different cultural groups myself, coming from a Sri Lankan background and living in Malaysia and then coming into Australia, and then having lost my own father, you sort of go through this process of understanding how people grieve in different cultural groups. And one of the things that I recognize through my own experience is that, we grieve. When I say we, I'm talking very much around my own cultural background, is when someone passes on, you have a 31-day grieving process. You have ceremonies that you need to undertake, rituals and prayers that you undertake. And that's a kind of an acknowledgement that this person has passed over. There's an ability to bring the community together to pay respects. And it also allows the people around you who have had a share in this person's life to grieve with you in that sense. I'm really interested to hear from yourself if there are any similarities between the Aboriginal culture and the way that you grieve a loss of a loved one in some of the other cultures, and if you see any similarities of the rituals or ceremonies that people actually undertake.
Really good question, really important question, because it enables me to talk to many Aboriginal people across this country. I'd say 90% of Aboriginal people across this country, well, actually doesn't know how to grieve like we used to, like our ancestors used to grieve.
Yeah.
And the reason I can say that is because we've got to acknowledge when 1788 arrived here, like our ancestors had 60,000 years of deeply spiritual, structured grieving ceremonies. And then when 1788 arrived, then, you know, our ancestors back in the day, they were forced to, well, genocide was a part of our story. You know,
Yeah.
it's you know, in the frame of truth telling, genocide was a part of our story, and so within that we had to, our ancestors had to stop language, had to stop all forms of ceremonies, because that was now deemed the devil's work. Right. And taken off country and put into missions and reserves. So that is really, our history is really still misunderstood.
Yeah. When
it comes to talking about loss and grief, or rituals. And rituals, in my understanding of rituals, is something that occurs, begins before, during, and after the death. Yeah. And yes, it can be up to like a month or two. But in my experience as a griefologist, grieving is an ongoing process, and there is always, with the right processes, if I could put it this way, the right strategies to grieving, a human can always come out the other end of the grief process and be whole again. And depending on the significant loss, that means for me, again, as a griefologist, that grief forgiveness, and notice how I put grief forgiveness together, because there is a category of grief emotions that sits within, and I call it grief forgiveness. Once we can go through a deep grieving process, we can come out the other end whole again. Yeah. And so sort of the concept of sorry business, you know, that's a terminology that's come out of the APY lands, which is the Arungal Pitjantjatjara Nyankajara peoples in the far northwest of South Australia. That's their English terminology around death and dying only. So that can sometimes get picked up by non-Arungal Pitjantjatjara people, but it's again, it's something that we as Aboriginal people here in South Australia and around the country, many find it really challenging to actually know how to grieve.
Wow. So I didn't know that it was, the term sorry business was actually just associated to a particular, can I call it language group or language group within Australia? I thought it was across all Aboriginal communities. I didn't know that. So thank you for raising that. So do you see any similarities, or actually it's, then from your perspective, from what you've just articulated, it sounds like it's not defined. And so across Australia, Aboriginal people might be dealing with grief and death quite differently. Would that be correct to say?
No, no.
Okay.
Not in my experience. Where it would differ, if we, which I've never lived up in the Yolngu country, like the east of Darwin,
Yeah.
and sort of that part of the world. You know, they still practice, and I've never lived there, only what I've seen on TV and spoken to people about over the years. They still have some sacred grieving ceremonies,
Yeah.
and they've only been able to hold on to them because it took like years for white people to find their way up there.
Right.
And it's like by the time white people got up there, as opposed to when they found Aboriginal people, traditional Aboriginal peoples down south here, their language, their ceremonies was able to stay intact.
Right.
But that's not to say that, you know, this thing called Aboriginal disadvantage is not within their community.
Sure.
That is still it's like that they reside together. There's Aboriginal disadvantage in these traditional communities, as well as ways of holding on to their traditional culture, language, ceremonies, grieving ceremonies. But my people, like on my side is Kaurna, on my dad's side, which is all the Adelaide Plains, and the Wirangu country on my mum's side, Western Australia, South Australian border. A lot of us have lost language. A lot of us lost ceremonies because when we were put onto missions and reserves, you know, religion played a big part in desecrating, dismantling our language and our ceremonies. So that is again also terribly misunderstood.
Yeah, and you raise quite an important point, because I think at the very grassroots level of every individual, there is a need to belong. There is a need to identify and understand that sense of who am I and where do I come from and what, you know, what's my heritage. And even if you're a person who doesn't then practice that, it's just knowing that I belong here, and this is where I generate my thoughts and my ideas and my belief systems. So that can be quite troubling for individuals who have been displaced in a way in their own country, you know, where you're the First Nation and you find yourself still arguing about the fact that, you know, there's a place for us, and this is who we are, and this is how we believe our systems to be, and what we see as valued. That can be very challenging, and I hear that a lot, you know, with the recent stuff that you see on television, as well as books that I've read about how the Aboriginal community at large has had to deal with so much displacement and trying to sort of, you know, the elders trying to sort of maintain that level of culture and make it relevant to the younger Aboriginal members of the community who are trying to assimilate and fit in. And it's very challenging. It's very complex. I hat off to you to, you know, taking on this as a way to try and strengthen the community. If I may, Jen, then sort of come into your healing center a little bit more and sort of understand, you know, the term you use, griefology. How do you actually go about doing your healing in that sense? I know you do a lot of presentations and facilitations, but what does your work really entail?
So just let me go into in its broadest terms, you know, describe the definition of griefology. Because of my research, I've now found a term Griefology, that is the study of the relationship between significant loss and unresolved grief of our ancestors, and how our ancestors unknowingly began passing their grief onto the next generation.
Yeah.
Which goes on to compound and complicate their contemporaries' losses and suppress unresolved grief. So, unbeknownst to me, as a modern contemporary Aboriginal person, I didn't know, when I was going through my intuitive research, using my lived experiences, that I was carrying, harbouring even, my ancestors' suppressed unresolved grief on top of what happened to me,
right,
in my childhood and adolescence, and then becoming part of the stolen generation and all the violations that took place in stolen generation. So those two categories, ancestral losses, we must understand that we carry, and this is not an Aboriginal thing. We carry the grief of our ancestors, especially if ancestors have been violated in some way, shape, or form. And it for me, it begged the question: what race of people haven't experienced an invasion?
Yeah.
Back in the day,
Yeah.
200 years ago, 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, there's ancestral grief that's been passed across and down the generations. And so we, as modern day contemporary humans, I would go so far as to say that we're carrying their grief on top of our major loss experiences, and our grief is suppressed and unresolved. And so that's a part of my healing, was to heal what happened to my ancestors, forgive through grief, 1788, when it arrived here so violently, forgive them and forgive my perpetrators, so that I could free myself up, and be released of their ancestral suppressed unresolved grief, and the resentment and the grief, anger for what happened to my ancestors, for the arrival of 1788, free them up. And I often imagine it like a human walking around with a dozen balloons on both arms, strapped to their or tied to their hand, to their arm. Imagine a dozen balloons tied to each hand, and you're trying to live and get on with life. But those balloons represent all the significant losses one has gone through. So what I found myself doing was going through a grieving process to come out the other end, to forgive through grief, that I could snip one balloon. And then I had to find another major loss of our ancestors or mine, and grief, forgiveness, snipped another balloon, until, and I was doing that for over 5 years.
Wow.
And then it's like,
a release.
I'm released from that. That doesn't condone the behaviors of perpetrators. It just frees me up, so that I, as a part of my work as a griefologist, I didn't know this at the time, but I had to do all of that healing and arrive at grief forgiveness for what happened to my ancestors, finding Plato, what happened to me as a child, as a teenager. I had to heal all of what I call my inner children who were violated, so that I don't, as a griefologist, I don't have grief triggers which could then do harm to my clients.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you hear that in different conversations as well about, people thinking about where you've come from and what you're carrying within without even realizing that you are. So it's logical what you're doing, where you sort of pretty much get people to face that and naturally release it. So it allows them to then function quite effectively.
Yeah.
In a sense, and especially if you're looking at your community and trying to sort of really pull them across this imaginary sort of barrier that they've built in front of them, because they've got all of this grief and it's triggered by conversations or behaviors or things that people feel naturally. I think that's really powerful. That's fantastic. And I know that you've got a symposium coming up, is that right?
Yes,
Which is
yes.
fantastic. And when is that actually, Rosemary?
So it's July 7th, here at the Adelaide Convention Centre. So it's face-to-face and virtual. And yeah, it's just time for me to put it out there and explain what is griefology, and how we as humans can find our way back to a healthy grieving process so that we can come out the other end empowered and as one, and to explain not just Aboriginal disadvantage to then find Aboriginal prosperity, but it's about all of us as humans who are experiencing disadvantage, and we all have a right, a role, and a responsibility. It's our basic human right to find prosperity, and that's what I want to talk to, with a view to inviting the Australian population to be a part of the solution, and Griefology prosperity is a part of the solution to not just Aboriginal disadvantage, but disadvantage for us as humans. The Australian population can support the Healing Centre through crowdfunding, philanthropy. I'd be interested in talking to investors, because I have to train, Mel. I have to train other people to become griefologists, because I think that that's what's been missing out of the health system, particularly psychology and psychiatry. So training is the purpose for the symposium, to explain why, so that we can work together as all Australians to reach our full potential as human beings.
I think that's good. And I'd really call on people who are actually working very much from my experience, I guess I'll call on people who are working very much in that family violence environment, where they're really struggling to try and decipher, how do we effectively not keep using a Band-Aid approach to that space, but to try and resolve it, working with the perpetrators and understanding where they're coming from, where is this rage and violent behavior and outrage coming from, and especially now with mental health and wellness being such an important aspect, and people are becoming a little bit more aware of this, of the need to help communities and openly talk about things without feeling, like you said earlier, without feeling it's a weakness or it makes you feel not relevant. It's very timely that you're running this symposium, and you're bringing to the forefront this very important aspect of an emotion that generally people don't want to discuss.
And not having done any further academic research, but I'm absolutely open to it. I can see where griefology can address the onset of mental health challenges, diseases and disorders, family violence, domestic violence. It's a preventative model to a whole gamut of social determinants that
Yeah.
causes and maintains this thing called disadvantage. You know, I've worked with victims and perpetrators of family domestic violence, and I can see their story. I can see their unresolved loss and grief from childhood family violence, which is my story, which then took me into adult family violence, which is you know, my story. And my research showed, how did I get from childhood family violence to adult family violence? Well, my mum and dad exposed me to it, but they were exposed to it by their parents, and then their parents were exposed to it. So family violence, domestic violence is in my estimation, is learned behaviour. No human baby is born with a disease, well, with diseases that can be preventative through using loss and grief processes. They're not born alcoholics. They're not born with a mental illness. So my question always was, well, how does that happen then? And so Griefology can really talk to those things, but you know, the symposium wants to encourage the Australian population to support the Healing Centre so that we can do more research using Griefology.
Understood. Look, thank you so much for being a part of this show today, being a guest on the Transit Lounge. I think what you're doing is really important work, and I really hope that people who are listening understand that work like this needs support and ongoing research and training, and like you said, there's a preventative methodology that you're looking at, and it's such an important part of our society now at large. So once again, thank you so much. What I'll do is make sure that people can access the symposium details through the site. And I hope that you're extremely successful in whatever you do. And you honestly have such a beautiful energy about you. You know, even though we haven't met face to face, just meeting you on Zoom this couple of times, I can just see, you know, what you've described, in the sense that you've released yourself of all of this, you know, negativity, and you're now in this space where you feel, I want to help and I want to teach people what it is that I've gone through and how they can get there. And you know, it's I can see that just by looking at you. So it's wonderful. Look, thank you so much, Rosemary, for your time today. And
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much, Mel.
I'd hope that we'll be able to perhaps have another chat down in a couple of months, and to see how you're progressing, and if there's anything else that we could sort of explore and talk about. I really look forward to that.
Fantastic. Love to. Thank you so much, Mel, for your time and helping me put Griefology out there as well.
Not a problem. Take care. Talk to you soon. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.